I've got a 5-part series on using sample 1 that covers every single knob and dial, and it's over an hour long and it's a couple of years old, so I thought I would like to put together something that's a bit more concise. And for those of you who want to know more about sample 1 and would like to get started right away with the most important and tasty features of sample 1 without needing to watch the 5-part series. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get this started, and I'm going to try to cover the most important things that you would need to know in less than 20 minutes. So as with most things, we can click, hold, and drag the sample 1 to our arrange view to load that up. We can then load a sample by clicking on the plus button, and this is going to open up a Explorer window on the PC or Finder on the Mac. But let's remove this out because I'd also like to show that if we were to come to our files window where we have our samples, we could also right click on that sample and choose to send to a new sample 1 and then a track, and the sample 1 will be created for us. Let's shift T and remove the track for the older one. Now that sample is going to be placed on, the original sample will be placed on C3, and we can see that we've got that highlight there. We can also see up above the root is set to C3. Anytime we'd like to change that, we can click once and manually put in a value, or press a key or a drum pad on our external MIDI controller, and this will be populated automatically for us. We can then see the low for the range that this is spread across, and that represents this blue bar above our virtual keyboard. The high is going to be on G8. And we have a mapping view that we can click on this tab here, so we can see how that sample has been spanned across our keyboard. So let's move this over to the right, close our browser, and I'm going to press caps lock to bring up the virtual QWERTY keyboard. And I can then play back our sample. Now, if you have a monophonic sample like an 808 like I'm using, you could always use the tuner in Studio One to find the pitch and then set that yourself, as we just saw a moment ago. And if you'd like to load multiple samples, then you can simply click, hold, and drag from the browser and then drop into the samples list area, and then you're going to have 2 samples loaded. So if we come to the mapping, then we can see both of our samples spread across the entirety of the keyboard range. But again, if we'd like to change the range that plays back our sample, we can use this bar here. So this mapping view is going to be really useful for when we have multiple samples loaded into sample 1. If we'd like to remove a sample, then we can right click on it and choose remove sample. If we'd like to remove all of the samples, then we can choose remove all. But for now, I'm just going to choose to remove this one. Next, we have a trigger mode for the sample that we've loaded in. By default, that's going to be on normal. And when normal is selected, then the amp envelope, whatever we set our ADSR to, is going to be how this sample plays back over time. Let's actually find something a bit longer. So I'll click and drag on the waveform display to remove the old one. Now, when I press a key and just tap, you can hear that it immediately stops because we're in the normal trigger mode and our release is turned all the way down. If I were to increase the release time, then it's going to play back. You can see the pop-up window there, nearly 3.5 seconds. Even after I release, it's going to continue to play because we've increased our release time. But I will take that back down. And just to show, the next mode that we have is one shot. So if we choose one shot, then the entire sample is going to be playback even after I release. The next mode that we have is toggle. So with this, it's going to play the sample back, but if I press the key again, it will stop it. So I'll press and release, press again to stop it. Now this toggle feature could be useful if you're working with a maybe say a pad or an atmospheric loop that you'd like to continue to play back until you choose to make it stop. So let's quickly take a look at that. I'm going to caps lock to hide the virtual keyboard. Let's come to our loops and let me see if I can find a loop here really quickly. Okay, so I'm going to drag this loop to the waveform display to replace the old loop. And let's go ahead and move on to the loop section so we can take a look at this in tandem with the toggle. So by default, the loop will be off, but once we choose sustain or any of these other ones, we see we now have loop markers that show up. So I'm going to pull this one back, and let's pull this one in a bit. And actually, yeah, we'll do that, and then I'll go ahead and press the caps lock to get the QWERTY keyboard. Let's trigger. So I've released the key, but it's continuing to play back. If I press the key again, then it's going to stop. So again, if you have a atmospheric sample or any sort of loop or sound that you want to continue to play back and allow you to turn it off, then you can use the toggle feature along with the sustain. And if you notice there was some clicking in there, you can use the crossfade here. Click, hold, and drag that up. To get rid of your click. And since we're already here, let's go ahead and take a look at how these modes work within the loop section. So let's change our trigger back to normal, and this is going to make use of our amp section. So with sustain, the first one, sustain mode, if I press and hold and then release, we stop immediately because our release time is down. If I were to take our release up, now if I release the key, it's going to continue playing the rest of the sample for the release time that we have set here, which is almost 2.5 seconds. Now the next mode here, release, it's going to continue to loop for the release time that we have set here. So I'll press and hold. Now when I release, you see it continues to loop in that loop region. Now the last mode that we have is ping pong. So this is going to play forward, then back, forward, then back. And once I release the key, it's going to continue to do that for the release time that we have set here. Now I will release, and we continue that ping pong behavior for the release time that we have set here. Now let's move on from the loop section. I'll turn that off. And we did cover all of the trigger modes, yes. So we next have reverse. This is going to be pretty obvious. Once you activate that, we start playback from the end of the sample to the front. We then have, let's turn that off. We then have normalize, which is going to take the highest peak of our audio and raise it up to 0 dB and raise the rest of our audio up as well. You can see that visually once I click, how that's been adjusted. I'll go ahead and turn that off. We can then see the name of the particular sample that we have loaded or selected if you have multiple samples loaded in your sample list. We have left and right arrows, and these will allow you to navigate in the folder to the previous and next samples that are next to the one you have loaded. So we have this Music 115 Gentle loaded. So if I hit the right arrow, then you can see that we move on to something that is not the shine pad, which is what I was expecting, but this could be because we're working with a sound set. So let's come to the Files tab. I'll come back to the 808 file. Let's bring that in. We're on 003. So when I click on the right arrow, we should move to 004, 005, and so on. Clicking the left, we go back. So this could be good if you're using sample 1 for your snare, hats, 808s, kick, and you want to experiment with different kicks and snares, 808s, etc. in the folder that you're pulling it from, the original sample. You can easily go through here while you're playing your song back and find one that may fit better with your song or your track. Now I'm going to come back to the loops and let's bring that pad back in. We've already taken a look at the root, low, and high controls. So the next thing is we have these markers that will determine what portion of the sample that is going to be played back. So if I move these in and trigger this, we can hear that it's only going to play back that selected portion. We have start and end markers that we can use to make fine adjustments. So if you take note of the left marker here, when I click, hold, and drag up, we can see that that moves in a really precise way. The end marker, that right marker, we can see that that moves. We can also click once and manually enter a value. We also have that for the loop feature as well. So if I turn that sustain back on, and let's move these, we can see that these adjust based on the position of our loop markers. So if we wanted to make fine adjustments to those markers, we could also click, hold, and drag up and down, or click once to manually enter a value. Let's turn that off. Now we've got a magnifying glass here, and when we click that once, this should zoom in just to this selected portion. So if we click on the magnifying glass once, we zoom in on that portion of audio that's being played back. If we click again, then we're going to zoom all the way out to view the entirety of the sample. Now with the left and right, say if we zoom in a little bit, this should center the left marker. But I've been having some issues with this, so I'm not sure. Okay, so that kind of moves to the left, and that one shows the right. So I guess you have to be zoomed in a bit. But if you need to access these markers, say if you're getting some clicks or pops at the marker and you need to view it, then just click on it and then you can make your adjustments. If you'd like to really zoom in, just click, hold, and drag down. Moving while you're holding, you can move to the right or left. And this does snap. If you notice that, it tries to snap to zero crossings where there is no audio being played back here. So you can see that snapping behavior. So this should help you avoid the clicks and pops, but if you do get them, just continue to make adjustments and zoom in for finer control. We can use our mouse wheel to zoom in and out also, and we have a slider here that we can use. We have a data zoom to make our waveform larger. Now this is not going to increase the amplitude or volume of our sample, but just the visibility, the vertical view. Now I'm going to turn the one-shot mode back on and take the markers all the way back out just to show that if you need to, if your audio is out of control, I'll play this back and you want it to stop, you can click on the all notes off to get that to stop. And now I'm going to bring in another sample just to show you that when we make adjustments in the fields down below, say the release here, this is going to change for every sample that you have loaded. So if I take the release all the way up for the gentle pad, let's select the Neo Soul, you can see that the release has been taken up for this as well. If I lower it, the gentle pad, that's been lowered. If you'd like to make adjustments to individual samples, then click on the Edit Sample. We can see that the color changes to let you know that you're editing that specific sample. So now when I take the release time up, let's take that off, click on our Neo Soul, our release is still down. But if we come back to our gentle pad A, click on Edit Sample, we can see that that adjustment has been retained for this one particular sample. If you've made adjustments to your samples and you'd like to reset them all, just click on the Reset button. Okay, now down below we have pitch, filter, amp, and LFO sections, and most of us are familiar with these controls. So we'll just take 120 seconds to look at some of this here. Okay, so we can change the pitch of our sample in semitones by using the transpose. And let's actually bring in a drum loop for this. Okay, let's drag our drum loop in and replace the previous one. And we're talking about the pitch here, so now when I trigger this, let's control click to take that back to the default. And let's get our QWERTY keyboard back up. I'll trigger at the root note of C3. Okay, so we're hearing our sample played back at the original speed. Let's get all of our sample playing. Now when we adjust with the transpose and take it down in semitones, let's go ahead and take that down, let's say 4 semitones. Okay, so we can hear, and I'm sure most of you know, that it's going to change the pitch, raise the pitch, but also speed up. So if we take this to really extreme, so we change the speed when we adjust the transpose, but we also have a follow song tempo. So if I were to activate this, sample 1 is going to try to play it back at the original speed while also changing the pitch. So let's lower this. Now if I were to take this off, okay, so we can definitely hear how this is working. Just keep in mind that there's only so much that the algorithm can do. If you have this transpose really low or really high, you're going to get a lot of artifacts in your audio. Let's control click to take that back to the default. With the tuning, we can tune and sense. Then we have ADSR controls for the transpose and tuning. We can apply our ADSR settings by using the envelope knob. We can apply LFO to the pitch. So if we'd like to, you wouldn't typically use this with drums, but if we were to take the LFO dial up a little bit, let's zoom out. Okay, so we can see in here that our pitch is being modulated by this LFO here, and by default it's on a sine. If we were to change this to a square, okay, so you can adjust the rate in hertz here when you are in the free mode. If you change to sync, then you're going to sync to the tempo of your DAW, which is 120, and you can make adjustments by quarter notes, eighth notes, and so on. Next to that, you have a beat delay, so you can introduce a bit of delay time. Let's turn the sync off, and we are working in hertz, so we can choose in seconds in the free mode how long it takes before the modulation of our LFO is introduced to our sample. So let's take this up to 1 second. Let's take that up a little bit more. Okay, let's control click to take the LFO off of our pitch. We can activate each of these sections by clicking on the LEDs up above. And for the filter, most of us are familiar with that. So let's click to activate. By default, we're going to be on a low pass. So as I lower the dial, resonance. So you can get some cool effects with the filter. We've got an ADSR for our filter as well. You would need to activate or make use of the envelope dial here to introduce that. We have velocity, mod, and LFO controls. We can add drive, which is going to add saturation to the filter. We can add punch. We can use the key control. And this drop-down menu here will give you access to a variety of different filters: low pass, high pass, band pass. Filtering is kind of processor intensive, so there's an eco mode there, and we have a soft control. Next we have the familiar amp controls for gain, panning, ADSR for our amp, LFO, velocity, and mod. And then we have our LFO section, which we have taken a look at. Here we have master volume control, and by default, sample 1 is going to play back up to 32 voices at a time if you trigger 32, or if they have a long release or sustain time or release time. We can click, hold, and drag to increase this all the way up to 64. We can click once in the field to manually input a value. We have mono here that we can click to engage mono mode. So only one voice will be triggered at a time. And even if you press and hold, when you press another note, the previous one will be dropped. If you'd like to introduce a glide, then you can use that to activate glide. And this will be your glide time control. Let's control click to take that back, turn our glide off. And then here we have an effects button so we can see all of the effects that we have. I went over each of the effects in great detail in that 5-part series, so I'm not going to cover these here. But just know we have 2 banks, effects A with modulation. Clicking on the name, we activate. Delay, reverb. In effects B, we have a gating effect, EQ, distortion, and a panning effect. We can then hide the panel if we don't need it by clicking on the effects button. Below that, we have a virtual keyboard show hide button. And this is basically just going to show the keys that are being played while you are using your external controller, or you can use the keys here to audition. We have bend control. So by default, this is going to be set to 2, and that's in semitones, so we can raise or decrease the pitch of our sample by 2, +2 or -2 semitones. We can always click in this field once and then put in a different value. So if I put in 8, okay, so I think you can adjust this by up to 4 octaves plus or minus. We then have our mod wheel, which is going to tie into the mod controls here for the filter, the amp envelope, and the LFO. So you would need to activate this either to the right or the left. This is going to change the polarity, which direction you go, and then use your mod wheel to affect that parameter. Now coming back up to the top, we've taken a look at the mapping editor, and next we have envelopes, and this just ties in with the envelopes down below. So if we're working with the pitch and we make an adjustment to the attack, this is going to give you a graphical display of the changes that you're making, and you can always see the amount of time that you have, the adjustments that you've made with this numerical display down below. So this is kind of handy visual reference to see. You can also use the handles up above to make adjustments. You can adjust the curve of the attack and the decay with these controls here. And last but not least, sample 1 is not only a sample player, but it can record as well. So if you'd like to sample an instrument or a vocal, then you can easily do that. You can choose the source that you're monitoring by clicking here. So I'm using Windows Audio in order to record this tutorial. I can't do that with Osio. So the left and right are the 2 mics built into my laptop display. But you can, normally I'd be using my audio interface, and if you're using your audio interface, you can choose any of the inputs there. You can also choose to sample from any bus that you have within your project or your song. You can sample from your instruments. So I've actually got an impact loaded in this song, so I could sample any of the channels coming from the impact. I have a drums bus that I created that all of these channels are routed to, so I could sample that bus. You could sample the main output as well. So you have a lot of different options here. But with this set to the built-in microphones on my laptop screen, all we would need to do is just enter into record. And I just clap my hands there. And I think there must be some sort of limiter on the Windows operating system because the claps were really compressed here or limited, whereas my vocals were not. But anyway, we have recorded that or sampled that. So now if we come to the waveform display and choose our sample, and let's move the location marker in. I'll trigger with the QWERTY keyboard. Let's get rid of this. And actually, this is important because when you record, it's going to place that sample on one key. So this was placed on C1. If we come to the mapping view, we can see that that was placed on C1. If you'd like to spread it across the keyboard, as we've seen, come to the edges, we can spread that out. Let's come back to the waveform display. Let's come down an octave in our QWERTY keyboard. And I just clap my hands there. Okay, and it sounds awful because these are the mics on my laptop. Now let's come back to the record, and I'm going to right click and remove that sample. Just to mention a couple other things, next to the input we have monitor, where if we have monitoring turned on, which we can activate by clicking on the speaker icon, we can choose where that audio, that monitoring is being sent. We can also choose a name by clicking in this field here that we'd like to assign to the sample that we're getting ready to record. We can choose the resolution, and we can choose the insertion key, which is where that root sample will be placed at. And the final thing that we'll talk about here with the live sampling feature is we do have a gate record. So we could choose to have sample one automatically enter into record when the audio level has reached a certain level and stop recording once it falls below a certain level. And we can set those with the gate threshold, the close, and open. We can right click and manually put in a value, but it's probably just simpler to use the controls here. So this one is going to determine when the recording begins, the open, and this one here is going to determine when the recording stops. So in order to use this feature, we would use the gate record. So I'm just going to press gate record. It won't begin recording until audio goes beyond this marker here. Check. 2, 4, 6. And then we press stop. So now you can see we have multiple samples that have been recorded. If we come to the wave view, we can see they're all discrete samples that have been recorded using those gate controls. So if we look at the mapping for this, the first one begins on C#1, then D1, D#1, and E1. And we can see that highlighted with this bar here. 2, check, check, 2, 2, 4, 4, 6, 6. Okay, so this could be a really useful thing if you wanted to sample, say, an instrument and record different pitches for that instrument, and then create your own preset for an instrument that you have. And just by coming up to the top and storing it as a preset, then you'd have access to be able to use that in other songs that you are working on. Okay, so this turned out to be a lot longer than I had originally planned, but I feel like it's densely packed with a lot of useful information, so I hope that it's been helpful for those of you who are getting started with Sample 1 and were wanting to know all about the features to get you going. So we will wrap up here. Thanks for watching.